think it's time we talked about some of the things that have been said in my YouTube comments. Except maybe not for the reason you think. I'm not interested in talking about the number of new ways that people have found to call me gay or get their slurs past YouTube's auto-moderation systems. I'm really not interested in crying about people commenting on my whiny or extremely gay voice. No. I really just want to talk about it because it makes for a good example. Because, you see, I like to moderate my comments. I actually like to err on the side of over-moderation. I want my comment section to be a welcoming place. A place where we can disagree for sure, but also a place where name-calling and insults and bad faith arguments are not welcome. YouTube and the US government, as we'll talk about in this video, have given me mechanisms to delete comments that don't fit that vision and to remove users entirely that leave those comments. Like this one. Or this one. Or these. Oh, and here's my favorite. I remove things that don't make this place better for you to hear about the policy and culture around tech and gaming. And I hope that you appreciate the work that I do. It's work that I'm happy that I can do, even if I'm not happy that I have to do it. But it wasn't always like this, because for a while there, it looked like content moderation on the internet might not ever exist. And in fact, it looked like a place like YouTube could have never existed at all. And for that, we have this guy to thank. And what does Jonah Hill's character from The Wolf of Wall Street have to do with YouTube comment sections? We're gonna get into it. In 1994, an anonymous user on Prodigy's Money Talk message board posted that Stratton Oakmont and Danny Porish, the real-life person that Jonah Hill's character Donnie Azoff was based on, were criminals and that they were committing fraud. In response, Stratton Oakmont sued both Prodigy Services and that anonymous user. Now, in 1991, CompuServe, another internet services company, had been sued for similar reasons. But CompuServe actually won that case. They won the case because the court decided that they were not liable for the content that their users posted. The court said they weren't liable because CompuServe didn't do anything to moderate their message boards. So since they weren't making any editorial decisions, the court didn't find any reason to treat them like they would a publisher. They didn't need to find them responsible for the content on that platform. In 1995, however, Prodigy Services lost their case. You see, Prodigy billed itself as a more family-friendly company, and they actually had community guidelines and they moderated their platform in response to those community guidelines. Those actions are why the New York Supreme Court said that they needed to be held liable for the content on their message boards. But this result didn't just affect Prodigy. It affected anyone who ran a service on the internet where users could contribute content. And it freaked out all of these internet companies. No one wanted to be responsible for what any one of a multitude of users would say. And a lot of them wanted to moderate their platforms, at least in some way. Now, moderation seemed like it might make things worse. But these internet companies were not the only ones paying attention. And in 1996, Congress, while drafting the Communications Decency Act, included Section 230 of that act directly in response to these issues. Now, you've probably heard the word Section 230, and if you haven't, you've at least seen them written out in all caps on Twitter. There's lots of talk of repealing 230 or Section 230 reform, and there's lots of angry yelling from conservatives about Section 230 liability shields. If you don't know what Section 230 does, though, that's fine. A lot of people get it wrong, but it is pretty straightforward. The critical portion is actually only 26 words long. It's pretty succinct. Those 26 words read, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider." All this does is establish that any operators of any computer service are not liable for the content that their users post. That's it. That's all it does. You might hear people talking about publishers and platforms. None of those words are defined here. All these 26 words do is say that a company that runs a computer service is not liable for the content that its users post on those services. That's it. Now, for a lot of people, this is where knowledge of Section 230 usually stops, but it's more complicated, and I think there's two more important things that you need to know about Section 230. And the first is down in the next bit of the law. You see, those 26 words are actually Section 230, subsection C, paragraph 1. But if we go down to paragraph 2, we'll find a part of this law that actually explicitly allows for moderation of these platforms. The second thing that people often miss actually is the first 4 words of those 26 words: no provider or user. And this is actually why I bring up the comments section of my YouTube channel. If Section 230 were repealed, for example, I, a YouTube user, would now be liable for anything any commenter said in my YouTube comments. I would be responsible for all of those people saying vile stuff in my comment section. If people got into an argument in my comment section and someone wanted to sue me for leaving it there, they could technically do that. I guess simply because I take action to moderate these comments. So it's not just about big companies, because no provider or user means that individual users of these platforms will be affected, as long as those individual users have some measure of control over these internet spaces. And speaking of comments, before we move on, it would just be really neat if you could leave a nice comment, the kind I won't delete, to counteract some of the hateful stuff. So why is it that people want to repeal Section 230? Well, most of the talk of Section 230 repeal comes from conservatives who see any sign of moderation of content on social media platforms that's against them as proof of anti-conservative bias. This is why our former president would often tweet, "Repeal Section 230," anytime one of his tweets would get labeled, despite the fact that labeling is technically not a moderation action, but you know what? We only have so much time in this video. However, it's not just conservatives. Center-left Democrats have also talked about repealing 230. In fact, the only words that President Biden said about Section 230 while campaigning were that it should be repealed. Most people don't really know what this law does. Many people seem to be introduced to Section 230 because of Senator Josh Hawley. He has introduced many bills that seek to limit Section 230's application based on if a company has done certain things. He's introduced bills that remove Section 230's protections from companies that use targeted ads. He's introduced a bill that removes those protections from companies that censor political speech. Many of his bills, if actually passed, would run immediately into some First Amendment issues, but he seems to be dead set on using Section 230 as a bargaining chip for political moves with some of these large tech companies. Section 230 refers to moderation as any action voluntarily taken in good faith. Josh Hawley's actions are clearly taken in bad faith. We're going to see if I keep that joke in or not. The wildest thing, though, is that if Section 230 were actually repealed, like a lot of these folks seem to want, they would not actually benefit from some ultra free speech zone, free of moderation, because there would be more moderation, not less. Let's go back to my YouTube comments example. Say 230 is repealed. I, Matt Horton, am now liable for anything that is said in my comments section. I am going to be extra careful what I let stay in there. I'm going to delete a lot more comments because I don't want to get sued. In fact, I might actually turn off my comments altogether. I don't want to do that, but I might do it to protect myself. Now scale that up to these giant platforms. We can go to the ex-president's favorite platform, Twitter. Now, Twitter's not going to shut itself down, but it is immediately going to go hard on moderation. In fact, I bet it starts vetting entire profiles and accounts on day one. And I think these folks know that. I don't actually think any of them actually want to repeal Section 230. I think they are all using it as a bargaining chip to get what they want from these companies. They have zero desire to repeal this law. They're just mad that they can't be transphobes on Twitter. But not everyone wants to repeal 230. You'll see a lot of talk of Section 230 reform. In general, the argument goes something like, yes, repealing 230 is preposterous, but we've come a long way since 1996. We know a lot more about how people communicate on the internet in 2021 than we did back then. So we need to reform Section 230, not repeal it. And look, that is a pretty sound argument. It's definitely more sound than repeal 230. I personally would argue that I don't think we yet know enough about how people communicate given the introduction of the internet. I frankly just don't think it's been long enough. But say that I give these folks that. I still have not seen a piece of reform that I trust. And actually, we've already had Section 230 reform. Have you heard of FOSTA SESTA? That was Section 230 reform. FOSTA and SESTA were a pair of laws that edited Section 230 to make providers liable for any ads for sex work that were posted by their users. This was intended to reduce human trafficking. It was largely in response to the Senate investigation that found Backpage implicit for the human trafficking content that was found on that site. Many cases had been brought against Backpage, but none of them could stick because of Section 230. But here's the thing. FOSTA SESTA hasn't made a dent in human trafficking. And Ron Wyden, a Democrat who was one of the original authors of Section 230 and one of only 7 senators to vote against FOSTA SESTA, he predicted that. Now, in the early days of FOSTA SESTA, we did see an enormous dip in the number of postings of sex trafficking ads online. But in the time since then, those numbers have gone back up to 75% of their original volume. What FOSTA SESTA has done is made it harder for legitimate sex workers to screen their clients. It's also made it harder for law enforcement to actually catch human traffickers. And FOSTA SESTA is also what is behind all of these recent terms of service changes that have made the internet more and more puritanical. You might be most familiar with Tumblr. It was once a welcoming space where fandom and sexuality blended fluidly. And then there was the 2018 porn ban. But more recently, queer communities have found that their content and their accounts have been removed, suspended, or otherwise limited as platforms like Instagram or Patreon or Twitter move to make similar changes to their policies. In the past couple of weeks, Democrats have introduced a new piece of Section 230 reform called the Safe Tech Act. And it would reform Section 230 partially in the same ways that FOSTA SESTA did, by adding an exception to that liability protection. But this time, instead of an exception for human trafficking content, an exception would be added for content that targets an individual with harassment, stalking, intimidation, or other types of abuse. The person targeted would be able to sue the platforms for hosting and not taking down this content. But more critically, and differently than FOSTA SESTA, the Safe Tech Act complicates those 26 words by adding 30 more. The 30 additional words are meant to prevent Section 230 from applying to advertisements, but the actual words read, except to the extent the provider or user has accepted payment to make the speech available, or in whole or in part, created or funded the creation of that speech. Now, yes, ads are speech for which the provider has accepted payment to make them available. But there are so many other types of speech that this applies to. Like, for example, I cannot see a patron-only post for a Patreon I do not subscribe to. That means that I cannot comment on that post. So in order to comment on that post, I need to pay both the creator and Patreon. So as I understand it, if the Safe Tech Act passed, the creator would be liable for any comments on their patron-only posts. And I don't think that this is what the authors of this bill intended. I just don't think that they understand how succinct those 26 words really are, or how much meaning was packed into them, or how important it is that they stay the same. God, I sound like a conservative. It really comes down to whether you want more moderation on the internet or less moderation on the internet. And I, along with the 230 reformers actually, would like more moderation on the internet. I would love to live in a world where baseless and dangerous conspiracy theories have a harder time to spread. But y'all, this ain't it. Look, I do think that platforms should be held responsible for not taking action on certain dangerous content. But neither the existing reform nor any of the proposals that I have seen seem to actually do that. I personally think that a better system would be to keep any of these platforms from feeling unavoidable. Look, maybe the reason that some conservatives feel that Twitter and Facebook should operate like the public square is because that kind of faux, intimate, parasocial communication has become core to the way that our politics and news and communities and even daily lives function. These spaces feel inescapable. They feel like spaces that a government might own, or at the very least regulate. But maybe that regulation shouldn't be of the speech on those platforms. Maybe that regulation should recognize that any platform that feels like a government is too damn big. That's right, folks. I think it's an antitrust issue. And just like that, we are right back home on this channel. I have already gone on too long, but if you feel that Facebook and Google and Amazon have too much power over what you can say on the internet, maybe focus on regulating that power. Twitter, I'm going to admit, is tiny in comparison to those companies. But I'll also admit that if we were just talking about Twitter, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. If you liked this video, and please say you did, there are two things that you could do to just really help me out. And the first is, like I said earlier, please leave a comment down below. Leave one of those comments that I said I am less likely to delete, one of those that is gonna make this a better place to hang out. That would be super awesome. And two is much easier. All you gotta do is click that thumbs up button and like this video. Both of those are things that make YouTube recommend this video to other people. And that is super awesome. It helps grow this channel, and it's just super kind of you. Besides that, you can subscribe if you'd like, if you want to see more of me. And also, you can share the video with your friends if you think that they would enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.